man, just a regular guy in my early 30s. Got a decent job in an office, the kind where you stare at a computer screen until your eyes glaze over. Married to Judith. We'd been together for years, since before the world got quite so loud. We had a nice little house in a quiet suburb, a lawn to mow, a driveway, a two-car garage. The house was hers. The garage, that was mine. It was my sanctuary, my escape. After a day of corporate nonsense and pointless meetings, that garage was the only place I could decompress. It wasn't anything fancy. Concrete floor, tool chests lining one wall, a workbench I built myself on the other. In the middle of it all was my pride and joy. A 1968 Mustang. It was more rust than car when I first got it, a long-term project. Every night, after dinner, I'd head out there. Put on some old rock music, nothing too loud. Just the simple, honest work of bringing something broken back to life. The smell of oil, the scrape of a wrench on a bolt, the satisfaction of seeing a dented panel slowly straighten out. It was my therapy. It kept me sane. I wasn't just fixing a car. I was building something, with my own hands. In a world where everything is digital and temporary, this felt real. I was also getting into woodworking. Simple stuff. A bookshelf for the living room, a new cutting board for the kitchen. The feeling of turning a rough piece of wood into something smooth and useful was incredible. Judith used to get it. Or at least, she didn't mind. In the early days, she'd sometimes bring me a cold drink while I was working. She'd lean against the doorframe, watch for a minute, and ask how it was going. She'd smile when I showed her a part I'd finally managed to clean up, or a joint I'd cut perfectly. She called it my tinkering. Said it was cute how I had my little hobbies. Our life was good. It was balanced. We had our time together, and we had our time apart. It felt healthy. Then something started to change. It was gradual at first. I barely noticed. She started spending more and more time online, scrolling through certain websites and social media feeds. Her language began to shift. New words and phrases started creeping into our conversations. Words like problematic, patriarchal structures, and emotional labor. At first, I thought it was just a phase. Everyone gets passionate about something. I'd just nod along. Yeah, I see. But then, the focus of these new ideas started pointing in my direction, specifically towards the garage. It started with little comments. I'd come in from the garage, hands covered in grease. You know, that smell is really quite aggressive. I'd laugh it off. It's the smell of progress. She wouldn't laugh back. A few weeks later, she came out while I was trying to diagnose an engine issue. She didn't bring a drink this time. She just stood there with her arms crossed. The look on her face was different. Not curiosity, but analysis, like she was studying a specimen. Her friend, one of her new online group friends, had apparently said that a man's obsession with cars is a classic sign of toxic masculinity. It's a way for men to avoid genuine emotional connection by retreating into a safe, non-communicative space. I tried to explain. It's not about avoiding her. It's about having something for myself, a way to clear my head. She just shook her head, like I was a child who couldn't understand a complex adult concept. The message was clear. My explanation was just another symptom of the problem. Soon the garage wasn't just my space anymore. It became a point of contention. Every evening, when I said I was heading out to work on the car, there would be a sigh. A loaded, heavy sigh that hung in the air. Dinner conversations turned into interrogations. Why did I need to do this? What was I getting out of it? Didn't I want to spend time with her, evolving as a couple? She suggested alternatives. We could take an online pottery class together. We could watch thought-provoking documentaries. We could join a book club that focused on social justice literature. I tried to compromise. I'd spend less time in the garage, maybe just a couple of nights a week. I suggested we find a show we both liked. I offered to help more around the house, even though I already did my fair share. It wasn't enough. Because the problem wasn't the amount of time I was spending. The problem was the hobby itself. It was, in her new worldview, fundamentally flawed. It represented everything she was being taught to fight against. My simple, peaceful hobby of fixing a car was now an act of rebellion against our relationship. One evening, I finished the bookshelf I'd been making. I was really proud of it. Solid oak, sturdy, perfect fit for the space in the living room. I brought it inside, all excited to show her. She looked at it, ran a hand over the surface. "It's very rugged," she said. The word was not a compliment. It's a symbol of how society forces men into these provider roles, making them believe their worth is tied to physical creation. I was floored. It's a bookshelf. I made it because we needed a place to put our books. But in her eyes, it was a piece of patriarchal propaganda sitting in our living room. The intervention, as she later called it, happened a few weeks after that. I came home from work, and she was waiting for me at the kitchen table. She had a whole presentation ready. Not on a screen, but in her speech. It was rehearsed. She told me she had been doing a lot of work on herself and on understanding the dynamics of modern relationships. And she had come to a painful realization. My hobbies were a barrier, a monument to performative masculinity that was preventing us from achieving true intimacy. She said she felt lonely, that while I was out in the garage communing with metal, she was inside bearing the emotional burden of the relationship alone. I tried to argue. I told her I loved her, that my time in the garage had nothing to do with my feelings for her. I said, everyone needs a hobby, something that's just for them. That was a mistake. That's the core of the problem, she said, her voice calm and steady, like a surgeon explaining a necessary amputation. This individualistic mindset, this man cave culture, it's designed to keep men emotionally isolated and women perpetually waiting for them to connect. It's a systemic issue, and it's playing out right here, in our home. She talked for nearly an hour. It was like a flood of buzzwords and theories I couldn't possibly argue against. Every defense I offered was twisted into another example of my unwillingness to do the work. My desire for a personal hobby was a refusal to be vulnerable. My love for mechanics was an adherence to outdated gender roles. My pride in building something was a subconscious need to assert dominance. It was like arguing with a brick wall that had read a lot of angry blogs. Finally, she got to the point. The ultimatum. For us to move forward, for our relationship to heal and grow into a true equal partnership, the garage had to go. Not just the time spent in it, everything. The car had to be sold, the tools, the workbench, all of it. The garage was to be converted into a shared space, a home gym maybe, or a yoga studio, something healthy and collaborative. I just sat there, staring at her. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a list of non-negotiable demands. I felt this cold knot in my stomach. It was a choice between a fundamental part of who I was and the woman I loved. I looked at her, trying to see the person I'd married. She was in there somewhere, behind this new, rigid ideology. I thought about what would happen if I said no, the endless fighting, the resentment, the inevitable end. I was a guy who fixed things. I wanted to fix this. So, in the biggest mistake of my life, I agreed. I told myself it was just stuff, a car, some tools, that Judith was more important, that maybe, just maybe, she was right. Maybe I was missing something. Maybe this would unlock some new level of happiness for us. I was a fool. The next weekend was one of the worst of my life. I put an ad online for the Mustang. Project car, needs work. A guy came to see it a few days later. He was my age. His eyes lit up when he saw it. He saw the potential, the dream. He talked about what he planned to do with it, the engine he wanted to put in. He was me from a few years ago. Selling it to him felt like I was selling a piece of my own soul. I signed the title over with a hand that felt like it was made of lead. As he drove it away on a flatbed trailer, I just stood in the driveway and watched until it was gone. Judith came out and put a hand on my back. "I'm so proud of you," she said. "This is a huge step for us." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The next step was the tools, my tools. Some were my grandfather's, the old wooden-handled screwdrivers, the heavy, solid wrenches. They had history. I couldn't bring myself to sell them. I packed them all into boxes, every socket, every file, every saw. I wrapped them in old rags and laid them to rest. Then I carried the boxes, one by one, up the rickety ladder to the attic. I pushed them into a dark corner behind old Christmas decorations and forgotten junk, out of sight, out of mind. Or so the theory goes. The empty garage was an echo chamber. My footsteps sounded loud and hollow. The bare walls seemed to mock me. The oil stains on the floor were like ghosts of a happier time. I closed the door and didn't go back in for a month. So began the new chapter of our lives. The evolved chapter. My evenings were now free, completely, totally free. The first week felt strange. I'd finish dinner, and my body would instinctively want to get up and head for the garage. But there was nowhere to go. So I sat on the couch, next to Judith. She was thrilled. She saw this as a massive victory. "Isn't this nice?" she'd say, snuggling up next to me. Just us, connecting. We connected by watching her shows. Documentaries about topics I had zero interest in. Foreign films with subtitles that I had to struggle to read. Dramas where every character was miserable and talked in circles. She would pause them every 15 minutes to discuss the underlying themes and the social commentary. I would nod and make non-committal sounds. My mind was a million miles away. I'd think about the wiring harness on the Mustang. I'd wonder if the new owner was having trouble with the third to second gear shift. I started to feel sluggish. Without the physical work in the garage, I had no outlet. I put on weight. I always felt tired, even after a full night's sleep. A fog settled over my brain. Judith didn't seem to notice my inner state. She only saw the external compliance. She saw me on the couch next to her, and she interpreted that as happiness. Her friends would come over, the ones from her online circles. They'd sit in our living room, drinking herbal tea and talking in their coded language. Judith would present me like a trophy. "Dorian has been on such an incredible journey of unlearning," she'd announce. "He's really deconstructed his attachment to performative masculinity. He even sold his car." Her friends would look at me with a mixture of pity and approval, like I was a rescued animal who had been successfully domesticated. I'd just sit there and smile weakly, feeling like an exhibit at a zoo, the man who was cured. The emptiness of my evenings was deafening. The satisfaction I used to get from fixing or building things was gone. My life was now completely passive. I wasn't a creator anymore. I was a consumer. I consumed television. I consumed the opinions of my wife and her friends. I consumed food because it was something to do. The house felt different. It no longer felt like my home. I was just a tenant in Judith's world. She decided to turn the garage into a yoga space. She painted the walls a sterile white. She put down soft foam flooring. She bought a big speaker for her meditation music. One day I walked in there, and the faint, familiar smell of oil and metal was gone, replaced by incense. Lavender, I think. I felt like a stranger in what was once my own kingdom. The worst part was how happy she was. She genuinely believed she had saved me from myself. She thought our relationship was better than ever because we were spending more physical time in the same room. She couldn't see the light going out of my eyes. She couldn't see that the man she had married was slowly fading away, being replaced by a listless, overweight ghost who just sat on the couch. I tried to talk to her about it once. I chose my words carefully. I told her I was feeling a bit down, that I missed having a project. Her response was immediate and predictable. She told me it was a natural part of the process. It was my ego mourning the loss of its toxic outlets. She said I needed to lean into the discomfort, to sit with my feelings, that eventually I would have a breakthrough and find joy in healthier, more connected activities. She even suggested I see a therapist, one that she had already researched, of course, one who specialized in helping men overcome their traditionalist conditioning. I gave up after that. There was no point. She had an answer for everything, an answer that always circled back to her being right and me being broken. So I just drifted. Work, home, couch, sleep, repeat. The days blended together. The weeks vanished. I lost touch with some of my old friends, the ones I used to talk to about cars and projects. What was I going to talk to them about now? The documentary I watched last night? I was isolated, not just from my friends, but from myself. I'd look in the mirror and barely recognize the person staring back, the tired eyes, the soft jawline, the blank expression. I was living a life that wasn't mine, all to keep the peace, all to save a marriage that felt more like a re-education camp. I remember one night, sitting on that couch, Judith was passionately explaining some complex social theories she'd read about. I wasn't listening. I was just staring at the wall, and I had this thought, clear as a bell. I have nothing. I had a job I tolerated, a house that didn't feel like mine, and a wife who loved a version of me that she had invented. Everything that had brought me a quiet, simple joy was gone, and it had been taken from me in the name of improvement. That was the bottom, the absolute pit. I felt a kind of despair I'd never known before, a quiet, hopeless ache that just sat in my chest, day in and day out. I thought this was it. This was the rest of my life. Just this. This gray, featureless existence. And I had agreed to it. I had let it happen. That was the thought that kept me awake at night. I had unlocked the cage myself and let the best parts of me fly away. Then one night, my phone buzzed. I was on the couch, of course, half watching some bleak Scandinavian crime drama Judith was absorbed in. It was a number I hadn't seen in a while. An old friend, a guy I used to play ball with years ago. I almost didn't answer. Social energy was something I just didn't have anymore. But I did. I stepped out onto the back porch. The cold air felt good. He got right to the point. He was running a men's league hockey team, a real low-level beer league kind of thing. One of their guys had torn an ACL. They were desperate for a replacement, just a body to fill a spot on the fourth line. He remembered I used to skate a bit, way back when, asked if I was interested. My first automatic response was to say no. I started to make excuses. I'm out of shape. I haven't been on skates in a decade. My gear is probably disintegrated in a bag somewhere in my parents' basement. But as I was saying the words, another part of my brain was screaming, do it! What was the alternative? Go back inside and watch 3 more hours of sad people in sweaters talking about their feelings? What did I have to lose? I had already lost everything that mattered, so I stopped myself, mid-excuse. And I said, you know what? Yeah, okay, I'm in. He sounded surprised, but happy. Told me practice was in 2 days, sent me the details. I hung up the phone and stood on the porch for a long time. It was the first decision I had made for myself in what felt like an eternity. It was a tiny spark, but in the total darkness I was living in, it felt like a bonfire. I told Judith I had reconnected with an old friend and was going to try playing hockey. She had a strange reaction, a mix of approval and suspicion. On the one hand, exercise was a positive outlet. On the other, a team of only men was a potentially problematic environment. She gave me a cautious green light, probably assuming I'd go once, realize how out of shape I was, and quit. Finding my old gear was an archaeological dig. The bag smelled like a crypt. The skates were dull and tight, but it was all there. The night of the first practice, I was incredibly nervous. I walked into the ice rink, and the familiar cold, a smell of ice in locker rooms, hit me like a time machine. It was a world away from my sterile, incense-filled house. The guys on the team were just guys. A plumber, a couple of IT guys like me, a high school history teacher, a guy who owned a small landscaping business, all different ages, shapes, and sizes. No super athletes. Just a bunch of guys who wanted to skate around for an hour and forget about their jobs and their mortgages. I felt awkward and clumsy putting on the gear. My fingers fumbled with the laces. But the moment my skates touched the ice, something shifted. I was terrible. My legs burned. My lungs felt like they were on fire after my first shift. I fell down at least 5 times. It was humiliating and exhausting and absolutely wonderful. For that hour, my mind was completely clear. I wasn't thinking about Judith or the garage or the soulless couch. I was only thinking about the puck, about staying on my feet, about getting the puck to the open man. It was simple. It was real. After the practice, we all sat in the locker room, exhausted and sweating. There was no deep emotional talk, no deconstruction of our feelings. We just made fun of each other's bad plays. We complained about our bosses. We talked about hockey. It was easy. It was effortless. On the drive home, I felt a kind of tired I hadn't felt in months. A good tired, a physical exhaustion that quieted the mental noise. When I got home, Judith was waiting up. She asked me how it was. I told her it was tough, that I was rusty, but that it felt good to move. Just be careful you don't get swept up in the jock culture, she warned. It can be very exclusionary. I just nodded. I was too tired to engage, but I knew I was going back. I went to the next practice, and the one after that. I started to get my legs back under me. My skating improved. I wasn't falling as much. I even scored a goal in a scrimmage, a garbage goal, a lucky bounce off my skate, but it felt like winning the lottery. My teammates cheered. They banged their sticks on the ice. It was a feeling of validation I hadn't realized how much I missed. The team became my lifeline. We had a group chat that was constantly active. Memes, game schedules, stupid jokes. It was a community. A brotherhood, as cheesy as that sounds. We were all there for the same reason. To have one place in our lives that was just simple, uncomplicated fun. The physical changes started to happen quickly. The weight I'd put on from sitting on the couch started to melt away. I was sleeping better than I had in years. I had more energy at work. The fog in my brain started to lift. My old self, the guy who liked to build and fix things, was starting to re-emerge. The passivity was being replaced by action. Judith noticed the physical changes, and at first, she approved. She commented that I looked healthier, but she failed to understand the source of the change. She thought it was just the exercise, a purely physical phenomenon. She couldn't grasp the mental and emotional importance of it. The problem for her started when it became a permanent fixture in my life. It wasn't just a phase, it was my new routine. Practice on Tuesday and Thursday nights, games on Saturday or Sunday. And after every single one, the team would go to a nearby dive bar for a pitcher of beer and some food. This post-game ritual was just as important as the game itself. It was where we bonded. Suddenly, 3 or 4 nights a week, I was out of the house. I wasn't on the couch next to her, available for connection and discussion. I was out in the world, living a life that she had no part in and no control over. And that's when her support began to curdle into resentment. The subtle digs started first. Another hockey night? You must be exhausted. I was hoping we could watch that new documentary tonight, but I guess your game is more important. She never called it a game. It was always my game in air quotes, as if it was some silly, childish indulgence. I tried to explain. I invited her to come watch a game once. She came. She sat in the cold stands for one period, looking at her phone the entire time. Afterwards, her only comment was that the sport was needlessly violent and that the cheering was a bit primitive. She never came again. Her attempts to pull me back into the old routine became more direct. She would try to schedule date nights on my game nights, then act hurt and betrayed when I told her I couldn't miss a game. She started complaining about the cost of the league fees and the new equipment I had to buy. I pointed out that it was a fraction of the money I had gotten from selling the Mustang, money that had gone into our joint account. That argument was dismissed as defensive and missing the point. The point, as always, was that I was doing something she didn't approve of. The texts started coming during the post-game hangouts. First, it would be a simple, "When are you coming home?" An hour later, "It's getting late, Dorian." Then, the guilt trips. "I'm just here at home by myself." It was a slow, steady campaign to make my one source of joy feel like a transgression. But something was different this time. Unlike with the garage, I wasn't isolated. I had my team. I'd mentioned Judith's complaints to the other guys, and they'd all nod in understanding. They all had their own versions of the story. Wives, girlfriends who didn't get it. They didn't offer deep psychological advice. They just said, "Yeah, that's tough, man. Hey, whose round is it?" That simple, unspoken solidarity was more helpful than any therapy session. It made me feel like I wasn't crazy. It validated my need to have this part of my life. My confidence grew. I was no longer the hollowed-out man who would agree to anything to keep the peace. I had rebuilt a part of myself, and I wasn't going to let it be taken away again. I stopped apologizing for having my own life. I would tell her my schedule for the week. Practice Tuesday and Thursday, game Saturday. I would tell her I was going out with the team afterwards and that I would be home late. I wasn't asking for permission. I was stating a fact. This shift in my behavior drove her insane. She couldn't understand where the compliant, couch-dwelling man had gone. She saw my newfound independence not as a sign of health, but as an act of aggression against her and our relationship. The arguments got worse. She accused me of being selfish, of abandoning her. She fell back on her old vocabulary. "You've just replaced one toxic male space with another," she'd shout. "You're hiding from emotional intimacy behind a wall of sweat and beer." I didn't shout back. I didn't have to. I would just calmly say, "I'm not hiding. I'm living." The irony was so thick I could taste it. She had wanted to eliminate the garage because it took me away from her for 2 hours a night. Her solution had resulted in me being gone for 4 or 5 hours a night, several times a week. She had wanted me to be more present and connected. Instead, I had formed the strongest social bonds I'd had in my entire adult life, and she wasn't part of any of them. Her grand project to re-engineer her husband had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. The final confrontation was inevitable. It had been building for months. It happened on a Saturday night. We had just won a huge game, the semifinals for our league's championship. I had played well, even got an assist. The whole team was ecstatic. We went to the bar, and the mood was electric. I got home around 1 in the morning, still buzzing from the win. The house was dark, except for a single lamp in the living room. Judith was sitting on the couch, the same couch where I had served my sentence for so many months. She was sitting there, bolt upright, with a look of cold fury on her face. I knew this was it. Before I could even put my bag down, she started. It wasn't a conversation. It was a tirade, an avalanche of all her pent-up frustration and rage. She told me she couldn't live like this anymore, that I was a stranger to her, that I was a liar who had pretended to want to improve our relationship, only to find a new, more effective way to escape it. She threw everything at me. I did all that work for us. I tried to create a healthy, balanced home. I got rid of that shrine to masculinity in the garage so you would have no choice but to be present, to be with me. Her voice was rising, cracking with emotion. And what did you do? You went out and found an even bigger, more time-consuming distraction. You chose them over me. You chose this stupid, childish game over your own wife. She was crying now, tears of pure, undiluted rage. I just wanted my husband home, and now I see you less than ever before. I am more alone now than when that stupid car was still here. Do you understand that? Your solution to our problem was to disappear. I let her finish. I let it all wash over me. In the past, this display would have crushed me. I would have felt guilty, ashamed. I would have apologized and promised to change. But I wasn't that man anymore. When she finally ran out of breath, the room was silent except for her ragged sobs. I took a deep breath. My heart was pounding, but my voice, when it came out, was perfectly calm, perfectly steady. You're right about one thing, I began. You are more alone now. But you need to understand why. I looked around the pristine, impersonal living room. This house, it used to be our home, but you turned it into a project. I became your project. You decided that parts of me were unacceptable, that the things that brought me quiet joy were toxic and had to be eliminated. I pointed in the direction of the garage. You took away my space. You took away my work. You told me that the only acceptable way for me to exist was here, on this couch, consuming the media you approved of and discussing the topics you found important. You didn't want a partner. You wanted a convert. I met her tear-filled eyes. There was no anger in mine, just a profound, sad clarity. I didn't disappear, Judith. I was evicted. You made it perfectly clear that the person I am wasn't welcome in this home. The things that made me feel alive and competent were banned. You took away the joy I found inside this house. I paused, letting the words sink in. So I did the only logical thing. I went and found joy outside of this house. This wasn't a plan to hurt you. It was a plan to save myself. I found a community that accepts me as I am. I found a passion that makes me feel strong and alive. I'm not avoiding you. I'm just not willing to be the hollowed-out version of a man you wanted me to be. I picked up my hockey bag from the floor. The weight of it felt good, solid. You didn't want the me who was happy in the garage, and you don't want the me who is happy on the ice. The truth is, you don't want me to be happy unless my happiness comes from you and is on your terms. And that's not a partnership. That's a prison. She just stared at me, speechless. The fury on her face had been replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. The logic was undeniable. The cause and effect were laid bare. She had engineered her own loneliness. Her victory had been her undoing. I didn't wait for a response. There was nothing more to say. I turned and walked down the hall to the spare room, which had slowly become my room over the last few months. I closed the door behind me, leaving her alone in the silent living room, alone with the consequences of her work. Alone on the couch that was supposed to be the symbol of our connection, now the monument to our divide. I unzipped my bag, and the familiar smell of the ice rink filled the small room. For the first time in a very long time, I felt truly, completely free.